negative entropy. It's the recursive loop of circulating value. Now, we humans can also participate in the circulation of unalienated value in these generative cycles. So ecological value can self-generate with organic agriculture. Labor value can be in a generative cycle with worker-owned production. And expressive value can be in the cycle when we open source data, when we open source spirituality, sexuality, when we emphasize human freedoms. 3 caveats. As you can see, abstract can still be unalienated, so we don't think of digital as the enemy. Second, artificial can still be unalienated. If there's one thing fascists love, it's appeals to nature. You know, your sexuality defies the laws of nature. We shouldn't mix races, that's against nature. And finally, the threats are not only extraction from above, but there are also threats from below. So if you look, for example, at GitHub, you can see that women's code is accepted at a smaller rate than men's code. So there's sexism happening from below, racism happening from below as well. Both capitalism and communism tend towards the extraction of value. When I was a graduate student, I was coming out of a systems engineering major and going into the history of consciousness program at Santa Cruz. And it used to make my professors' heads explode when I drew these diagrams of systems analysis. But in fact, when you look at pollution or labor exploitation under both communist and capitalist societies, they look pretty similar. And so we have to stop focusing so much on that horizontal axis of socialism versus capitalism and start thinking about the vertical axis, the orthogonal axis of generative versus extractive. Now, if you look at this aerial photograph of the Soviet Union, you can see below in Mongolia, lush green landscape, and above, the scarred desertification from Soviet technology. So those indigenous folks, even though we would call what they do low tech, had a superior kind of technology. They were doing it right. Now, I spent a lot of my time in Africa. I got started looking at fractal geometry in African villages. And at first, I thought they were fractals for the same reason coral reefs are fractals or trees are fractals, that it's kind of an unconscious bottom-up dynamic. But as I started to do interviews, I realized folks had recipes, they had algorithms for how to put these together, and even a symbolic vocabulary for how to think about recursion. So in this case, the snake biting its own tail. One of my favorite examples are these logarithmic spirals in a stamped cloth tradition called a dinkra. They've looked at organisms in nature, realized that these were logarithmic spirals, that they were in laws of black ink. Those symbols symbolize the commons, so how everybody's supposed to be able to contribute. Can you think of any other industry that can brag that the more we produce, the less environmental destruction is? It's remarkable. Engineers should be given this example when you study engineering in classes. The one place where we saw a point at which this could be better facilitated was in the use of wood fires, because wood burning does cause carbon problems and deforestation. So we've been working on a program to bring in solar technology to do the cooking of this ink. That'll make it more affordable and even better for the environment. My wife, you can see in the lower corner there, Professor Audrey Bennett, next to my graduate student David Banks. They were doing HIV prevention. So the bird with its head pointing backwards means you can always go back for a tradition. They worked with artisans who changed the motto to you can always go back for a condom. And they created a little texting system, so you could text and find out where the nearest place was to buy condoms from. But a lot of folks said that it was a matter of embarrassment. They were too embarrassed to buy condoms. We interviewed one soldier. He had this machine gun cradled across his neck like this. And he said, yeah, it's really embarrassing. So we figured, well, if Rambo there is embarrassed, everybody must be embarrassed. So we developed this DIY condom vending machine and made it low-tech so it could be produced in any village. The African engineering students made their own version of it, and since everything we do is open source, they were able to modify it so that it accepts now reproductive health kits as well. So it's terrific watching these things sort of spread in this viral way. We also produced a simulation system called Culturally Situated Design Tools. This is an example from Ghana, but you can do it for lots and lots of different cultures. European culture, Indian culture, Pacific Islander as well. We do controlled studies, so we set up classrooms in which there's one group doing it the normal way, another group doing it with the culturally enhanced version, and you can see that students that learn through their heritage algorithms, that learn through their own culture, are actually learning it better than they would otherwise. So this sets up a whole generative network in Ghana that we're experimenting with. And you can go to our website, and it's all open access, open source. Anybody can produce these cultural patterns and learn in the classroom and use the hardware blueprints and play around and modify these technologies. Let me wrap up this second to last slide with some of the examples. So working with African American students, they were very interested in this cornrow braiding pattern. So they created their own versions on the screen, and then they 3D print them and bring those in as mannequin heads to local hair braiding shops. And so now they're measuring to see if they can get an increase in the number of customers. Right below that, you see some adult hair braiders that were brought in, and they started showing the kids how to think about natural hair care products instead of artificial ones. They're using Arduino-based pH sensors, and some of the kids have already started marketing their own natural hair care products. Next to that, in the lower left corner, is a Native American student. They did not want to use 3D printers. So we had them do their 3D virtual designs, heritage algorithms, and then they themselves drill little holes and place the fibers into the holes. So it's sort of a cyborg 3D printer, but they really love that process. There's some women doing batik, so it's a wax dye printing practice. The latex foam was causing an environmental problem, so we introduced mycofoam. It's a mushroom-based foam. They designed the 3D printed molds. The mold grows in the molds, and then they attach a little handle and stamp with that instead. It's biodegradable. And we now have fractal architectures in Africa. Contemporary architects are now using those forms. It's also appearing in Black literature, the Afrofuturist science fiction that's coming out. You'll see fractals featured in those as well. So in sum, how do we design for generative justice? There's really just three parts. The first part on the lower right is to find that cycle of unalienated value, to find a place where it's being put in the commons and circulated. The next part is to attach some